No one ever imagines that a party celebrating their husband's promotion to director would turn into a night where his entire family would frantically call me over 80 times. But the thing I remember most isn't the incessant ringing of my phone. It's the moment my mother-in-law pointed a finger squarely at my parents and, in front of all her guests, barked an order that silenced the entire room. "We're running out of room up here. Your parents can go eat in the kitchen." The sprawling, crowded house fell utterly silent. My parents stood frozen. My husband, Mark, looked down at his shoes. And I laughed. It was a soft, almost inaudible laugh. But it was the laugh of someone who had just decided to end years of quiet suffering. I took my parents' hands and walked straight out of that house, leaving behind a sea of astonished faces. An hour later, as my parents sat in a Michelin-starred restaurant, a lavish meal they'd never dreamed of spread before them, things at my husband's house were just beginning to unravel. The lights would stay on all night, phones would ring off the hook, and the sounds of crying and shouting would echo through the halls. And from that moment on, they would finally begin to understand who, exactly, they should never have offended. That afternoon, I had stood in front of the mirror for a long time. The dress I was wearing wasn't designer, but it was new. I'd chosen a tasteful, muted color, careful not to stand out, because I understood my place in this house perfectly, a daughter-in-law who was tolerated, but never truly valued. From the living room, the sound of cheerful chatter and laughter drifted in. The house was more crowded than usual today. Extra tables and chairs had been set up, covered in crisp, new red tablecloths. The entire first floor was a testament to the catered feast that had been laid out. A large, garish banner was stretched across the main wall. "Congratulations on the directorship, Mark." My husband, the man of the hour, stood in the center of the crowd, a glass in his hand, a permanent smile stretched across his face. He nodded at every congratulation, laughed at every compliment. I watched him from a distance, feeling neither happy nor sad, just a hollow emptiness that was difficult to name. Around 5 p.m., my parents arrived. I spotted them from the gate. My dad was wearing his best and only button-down shirt, the collar faded from years of wear, carefully ironed but unable to hide its age. My mom wore a simple floral dress, her hair pinned up neatly. In her hands, she held a large wicker basket filled with produce from their small backyard garden, heirloom tomatoes, zucchini, a few jars of homemade jam. I knew this basket represented their whole heart. They hesitated at the gate to the manicured lawn, looking in as if they were afraid of stepping into a world where they didn't belong. I rushed out to meet them. "Mom, Dad, come on in." My mother smiled gently and nodded, while my father cleared his throat to hide his unease. The moment we stepped through the front door, my mother-in-law Carol's eyes shot towards us. I didn't need her to say a word to feel the sting of her gaze. It scanned my parents from head to toe, lingered on the basket of produce, and then her lips curled into a cold, thin smile. "Oh, you're here already," she said. Her voice wasn't loud or sharp, but it was so cold it sent a shiver down my spine. My mother, ever polite, replied, "Yes, we wanted to come early to see if we could help with anything." Carol waved a dismissive hand. "No need. We have plenty of help. You'll just be in the way." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving my parents standing awkwardly in the middle of the bustling living room, where everyone else was dressed in cocktail attire, laughing and mingling effortlessly. I found a couple of empty chairs in a corner and gestured for my parents to sit. But a few minutes later, Carol returned. "The main tables are full," she announced, her tone final. "We need those seats for Mark's executives and our side of the family. There's plenty of space down in the kitchen. It'll be more convenient for you to sit there." I froze. The kitchen, the place where the caterers were working, where the staff went in and out, that was the place she had designated for my parents on this important day. I turned to look at my husband. He stood there, glass of wine in hand, his eyes avoiding mine. He didn't object, didn't defend them. He just muttered something under his breath, just loud enough for me to hear. "Emily, don't make a scene. The house is full of people." His words felt like a dull knife. Not sharp, but they cut deep. My father was the first to stand up. He forced a smile. "It's all right, honey. The kitchen is fine." My mother said nothing. She just lowered her head, clutched her basket tighter, and followed my father. I watched his slightly stooped back, my mother's trembling hand clutching the hem of her dress, and a lump formed in my throat. In that instant, I realized that if I didn't speak up today, my parents would forever be relegated to the kitchen in the eyes of this family. I stood motionless in the noisy living room, surrounded by the clinking of glasses and celebratory toasts. But the only thing I could hear was Carol's voice echoing in my head. There's plenty of space in the kitchen. And right then, a silent decision took root inside me. The kitchen was at the back of the house, separated from the living room by a wooden door stained dark from decades of cooking. It was a place for staff, for caterers, for work. It had never been a place for guests to eat. Yet today, that was where my parents were sent, as if they were surplus to requirements at a party that included their own daughter. I stood in the living room, peering through a crack in the door. My father quietly placed the basket of produce in a corner and pulled out a chair for my mother. She sat down, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the cold tile floor. They didn't complain, didn't blame anyone. They just endured it in silence, as if they had spent a lifetime getting used to making way for others. My heart ached with every beat. The sound of clinking glasses from the party continued unabated. Someone loudly toasted my husband to the new director. A bright future ahead. Laughter erupted, and no one paid any mind to the small, hot kitchen in the back. That is, until my mother-in-law appeared. She stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, her cold eyes looking down on my parents. It wasn't a look of curiosity or unfamiliarity. It was one of undisguised contempt. "Scoot in a little," she said, her voice sharp enough for everyone in the kitchen to hear. "You're in the way of people coming through." My father quickly stood up and pushed his chair closer to the small table. My mother nervously did the same. I couldn't take it anymore. I strode towards the kitchen. "Mom, my parents are..." Before I could finish, Carol spun around. Her voice suddenly rose, carrying through the entire house. "What are you going to say? The house is full. They can eat in the kitchen. What's the big deal?" Her words landed like a thunderclap. I saw my mother's hand tremble. She bit her lip, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. My father stood motionless, his face turning ashen, his shoulders seeming to slump even further. Around us, a few relatives turned to look. Some pretended not to hear. Others glanced quickly before turning away. A few even smirked, as if they were watching a scene from a play that had nothing to do with them. I turned to my husband. He was standing not far away, still holding his wine glass, his gaze still averted. When I stared directly at him, waiting, pleading for him to say something, he just frowned slightly and lowered his voice. "Emily, don't blow this out of proportion. Today is a happy day. A happy day." The words caught in my throat, a laugh that wouldn't come out. A happy day for whom? For the man being toasted and celebrated? For the guests at the main tables, feasting and drinking? And my parents? They were pushed into the kitchen like the help. I took a deep breath. The air felt heavy, thick with the smell of cooking oil from the caterer's station. My mother-in-law was still standing there, her face a mask of victory, as if she had just successfully put me in my place. And in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity. If I swallowed this humiliation today, my parents would be treated this way for the rest of their lives. I looked back at my parents. Then I lifted my head, and a small, quiet smile formed on my lips. It was a smile that surprised even me. Not a smile of peacemaking, not one of resignation, but the smile of someone who had finally decided to stand up. The atmosphere in the kitchen was suffocating, a mix of hot oil, food, and the muffled noise of the party outside. It felt like being trapped in a small, airless room. My mother-in-law, Carol, still stood with her arms crossed, a triumphant look on her face. She was certain that, like all the times before, I would fall silent, swallow my anger, and let it go for the sake of peace. But this time, she was wrong. I bent down and took my mother's hand. It was thin and rough from a lifetime of hard work. She flinched at my touch, turning to me with worried eyes. "Emily, just let it be. It's okay." My father quickly added in a low voice, "It doesn't matter where we eat, honey. Don't give people a reason to talk." I looked at them, and a wave of sorrow washed over me, so sharp it was hard to breathe. Their entire lives, they had lived for their children. Their entire lives, they had been afraid of being a bother. And now, being humiliated right in front of me, their only thought was to maintain the peace for their daughter. I squeezed my mother's hand tighter. "Mom, Dad," I said slowly, each word clear and deliberate. "We're not eating here tonight." My voice wasn't loud, but it was enough for a few people nearby to hear. A relative turned to stare. The chatter in the living room began to fade. My mother-in-law froze for a second. Then, her brow furrowed. "What did you just say?" I stood up straight, still holding my parents' hands, and led them out of the kitchen. In that instant, the entire living room seemed to move in slow motion. The clinking of glasses stopped, conversations died down. A dozen pairs of eyes, curious, judging, waiting for drama, all turned towards us. My husband, Mark, saw me emerge, and his expression changed instantly. He hurried over, hissing, "What do you think you're doing? If you have a problem, we can talk about it later. Don't embarrass me in front of everyone." I looked at him, truly looked at the man I had called my husband for years. The man being celebrated as a new director. The man being toasted by his peers, and the same man who had stood by silently as my parents were ordered into the kitchen. "Embarrass you?" I asked, my voice surprisingly calm. "You weren't embarrassed when your mother sent my parents to the kitchen?" He flinched. Before he could answer, Carol's voice boomed. "Emily, what kind of stunt are you pulling now? We have a house full of guests. If you want to go somewhere, do it later. Don't stand here making a scene." I turned to face her. This time, I didn't look away. "Don't worry, Carol," I said, my voice steady and clear in the now silent room. "I'm not making a scene. I'm just taking my parents out for a meal. Somewhere they'll be given a proper seat." A low murmur rippled through the guests. "Is she really leaving?" someone whispered. Another person shook their head. "What a disrespectful daughter-in-law." I didn't care. I walked to the corner, picked up the basket of produce, and placed it in my father's hands. "Dad, could you hold this for me?" Then I took my mother's arm and led her straight to the front door. My parents were bewildered, their steps hesitant. "Honey, please don't," my mother pleaded. I whispered, just for them to hear. "Let me handle this tonight." As the front door opened, letting in the evening air, I heard Carol's voice, full of rage, behind me. "If you walk out that door, don't even think about coming back." I paused for a beat. Without turning around, I smiled. Because I knew the one who would be begging for a return call wouldn't be me. The front door clicked shut behind us. It wasn't a loud noise, but in my mind, it felt like the slamming of a door on a long, painful chapter of my life. Outside, twilight had settled. The street was busy with passing cars, their headlights creating shimmering pools on the pavement. The air was cooler out here, but my parents still walked with a hesitant, shuffling gait, as if they had done something terribly wrong. My father stopped and looked around. "So, where are we going now, honey?" he asked in a low voice. My mother tugged at my sleeve, her voice filled with anxiety. "Maybe we should just go back to our motel for now. We can figure it out tomorrow." Making a scene like that. People are going to say, "You're ungrateful." I looked at them, two people who had spent their entire lives being humble, accepting less, and enduring disrespect to the point where they saw it as normal. I smiled, but my voice was firm. "We're not going back to the motel. Tonight, I'm taking you out to dinner." My father looked surprised. "Dinner? Where?" I didn't answer right away. I pulled out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady, a stark contrast to my parents' trembling anxiety. I scrolled through my contacts, past familiar names, and stopped at a number saved under a simple, professional title. I hit dial. It rang less than twice before someone picked up. "Yes, Miss Evans?" The voice on the other end was young, professional, and respectful, clearly not a typical service worker. "Mr. Davies," I said concisely. "I need a private room for 3 tonight. It's peak time, Miss Evans." There was a 1-second pause, and then his tone shifted. "Of course. I'll arrange it immediately. What is your estimated time of arrival?" 30 minutes. "Understood. The VIP suite will be ready for you." I hung up. My parents stared at me, their faces a canvas of confusion. "Who are you calling, dear?" my mother asked softly. I took her arm, my voice softening. "You'll see soon, Mom." We caught a cab. As the car pulled away, I glanced back at the brightly lit house where the party was still technically happening, where people were congratulating a man, believing I wouldn't dare go further than the front door. No one spoke in the cab. My father stared out the window, the city lights flashing across his weathered face. My mother held my hand tightly, as if afraid I was about to do something reckless. The taxi finally stopped in front of a grand building, its facade brilliantly illuminated. The name, written in elegant, glittering script high above, was unmistakable. My father looked up and gasped. "This place..." My mother's eyes widened, her voice trembling. "Emily, this is a Michelin-starred restaurant." I paid the driver, helped my mother out of the car, and smiled. "Yes, we're eating here." My parents stood hesitantly before the gleaming glass doors, through which we could see a world of opulent staff in crisp tuxedos, patrons exuding quiet elegance. "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" my father asked, unable to believe his eyes. I shook my head. Just then, the glass doors opened automatically. A man in a tailored black suit hurried out and bowed his head slightly. "Miss Evans, you've arrived. Your room is ready. Please, allow me to escort you and your parents." The way he addressed me left my parents speechless. My mother turned to me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "He called you, Miss Evans?" I simply smiled and, taking their hands, led them inside. In my purse, my phone began to vibrate. One call, then another. I ignored them. I knew that back at the house, things were just beginning to fall apart. The door to the private dining room closed, shutting us off completely from the world outside. Inside, soft, warm light bathed the large round table covered in a pristine white linen cloth. Water goblets were already filled, napkins folded into intricate shapes. Every detail was so perfect that my parents just stood there, afraid to even sit down. My mother looked around, her voice barely a whisper. "Emily, a place like this must be incredibly expensive. Maybe we should just order something small." My father nodded in agreement. "Just a little something to eat and then we'll go, honey. Your mother and I can eat anything." I pulled out their chairs for them and smiled. "Tonight, you two order whatever you want. Don't worry about the cost. I'll take care of it." My mother hesitated. "When you say that, it makes me worry even more." I didn't explain further. I just poured them both a glass of water and sat down opposite them, my demeanor as calm as if this were just another Tuesday night dinner. A server entered, bowing politely. "Good evening. May I present the menu? Would you prefer your usual selections, Miss Evans, or shall I have the chef prepare a tasting menu suited for your parents?" My parents exchanged a bewildered look. I answered for them. "Please ask the chef to prepare something light, low in oil, and easy for them to enjoy." Of course. The server left, leaving my parents in a stunned silence. My mother stared at me, her eyes filled with a new kind of apprehension. "How do you know how to talk to them like that?" I smiled gently. "I'll tell you after we eat." The dishes began to arrive, each one a work of art. My father was so impressed, he said, "It feels like a shame to eat something this beautiful." But after the first bite, my mother nodded quietly. "It's delicious, and not greasy at all." Watching them, I felt a weight lift from my chest. At least for this one moment, my parents were being treated with dignity, not being shooed away or looked down upon. Just then, my phone vibrated on the table. Once, twice, then continuously. I glanced at the screen. "Mark." I turned the phone face down. Less than a minute later, it lit up again. This time, "Carol," then a cousin from Mark's family. I didn't answer. My father noticed. "Is something wrong, honey?" he asked quietly. I shook my head. "Nothing important." But the phone was relentless. It buzzed and lit up again and again. My mother looked at me, worried. "Maybe you should answer. They're calling so much. It must be an emergency." I remained calm. If it were something that truly required my attention, they would have spoken to me properly earlier. "For now, let's just eat." I said it nonchalantly, but I knew exactly what was happening. Back at the house, the atmosphere must have shifted dramatically. The party was likely disrupted. Mark was probably being cornered with questions, and Carol was probably starting to feel a prickle of unease. A person accustomed to ordering others around doesn't handle being ignored for long. The phone vibrated a few more times, then went silent. I took a sip of water, watching my parents, who were now eating with more ease. I thought to myself, give it another hour. Those calls won't be accusations anymore. They'll be pleas. Not even 10 minutes after the door had closed behind me, the atmosphere at my in-laws' house had soured. The lavish spread for the director's party was still on the tables, food getting cold, wine half poured, but the boisterous laughter had died down. Awkward silences punctuated the remaining conversations as people's eyes darted towards the front door where I had just exited with my parents. Mark stood in the middle of the living room, his face growing paler with each unanswered call. He dialed my number for the 10th time. Still no answer. A relative came over and asked in a low voice, "Hey, did your wife really just walk out?" Mark gave a weak nod, trying to sound casual. "She's just a little upset. She'll be back later." But even he didn't believe it. Carol sat at the head table, her face a thundercloud. She slammed her glass down, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet. "What an insolent girl," she fumed, unable to hide her fury. "Walking out in the middle of a party and taking her parents with her. Absolutely no shame." An aunt chimed in. Kids these days are too spoiled. You have to teach them their place. But a few others were starting to look uncomfortable. An uncle sitting near the door frowned. To be fair, telling her parents to eat in the kitchen in front of everybody. That's pretty rough. The comment was like a tiny spark. Carol whipped her head around. What's that supposed to mean? It's my house. I decide the seating. What's wrong with that? The uncle didn't reply, just shook his head. Just then, Carol's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, a frown on her face. An unknown number. She answered, her voice still sharp. Hello? Who is this? Whatever was said on the other end came quickly. Within seconds, Carol's expression changed completely. The hand holding the phone began to tremble visibly. What? What did you say? She stammered, her voice dropping, all the previous arrogance gone. The room fell quiet. Mark walked over. Mom? What is it? Carol held up a hand to silence him, her eyes glued to her phone. That's impossible. You must be mistaken, she said urgently. How could that be connected to what happened today? She hung up and sank into her chair, looking as if all the energy had been drained from her. What is it? Mark asked again, his voice now laced with urgency. Carol looked at him, her eyes for the first time showing genuine fear. That was someone from the bank. They said there's an issue with our corporate credit line. They need to verify some things immediately. An issue with what? Mark frowned. Our company's financials are solid. Carol shook her head. They wouldn't say. Just that it's related to a certain silent partner. The mood in the room shifted instantly. A few guests began whispering to each other. Some stood up, making excuses to leave early. Mark pulled out his phone and called his second-in-command. It rang for a long time before someone answered. Hello? Yes, it's me. Is everything okay at the office? There was a short response from the other end. Mark froze. What did you say? He asked, his voice rising in disbelief. They want to put the merger on hold? He hung up and turned to his mother. Mom, they said several key partners have suddenly backed out of negotiations. No explanation given. Carol swallowed hard. She looked around the once vibrant room, now filled with anxious, questioning faces. And for the first time in her life, a small, insignificant detail she'd never once considered came rushing back to her. Her daughter-in-law, Emily, hadn't argued back. She hadn't yelled or cried. She had simply smiled and walked away. With trembling hands, Carol picked up her phone and dialed my number. It rang and rang. No answer. As night fell, the lights in Mark's house remained on, but no one was in the mood to celebrate. The food grew cold, the half-full glasses of wine untouched. Guests made their excuses and left one by one, leaving only a handful of close relatives who sat around with anxious expressions. Mark collapsed onto the sofa, clutching his phone. He just finished one call and was immediately dialing my number again. It rang unanswered. He checked his call log. 15 calls, 20, 30. Not a single response. Carol paced the living room, her steps quick and agitated. She was no longer sitting like a queen, issuing orders and criticisms. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Call her again, she ordered. Her voice no longer sharp, but desperate. Keep calling until she picks up. Mark called and called again. When his phone showed 50 missed calls, real panic began to set in. Mom, he said, his voice trembling. She's never done this before. She never just turns off her phone. The statement made Carol stop pacing. She suddenly remembered that since the day I married into her family, I had never raised my voice, never argued back, never caused a scene. And today, my exit had been clean. No tears, no begging, no looking back. Carol's phone buzzed again. She jumped, but it wasn't me. It was a close relative, their voice frantic. Carol, our contact at Harrison Group just called me. They're reconsidering their entire partnership with our company. Carol sank back into her chair. Reconsidering what? She demanded. I don't know. The voice on the other end replied. They just said it was an order from someone higher up. Higher up? She snapped, out of habit. But the reply made her go cold. Yes. And this higher up is not someone we can afford to cross. The phone slipped from Carol's hand. Another relative saw her state and asked, Is it something serious? Carol swallowed hard and shook her head. I don't know. I don't know yet. But deep inside her, a new and terrifying fear was beginning to bloom. By now, Mark had called me nearly 80 times. He stared at the number on his screen, his hands shaking. Mom, do you think Emily is not as simple as we thought? The question, though whispered, echoed loudly in the silent room. Carol didn't scold him. She was quiet for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and dialed my number one more time. When it went to voicemail again, she left a message, her voice trembling audibly. "Emily, please, can you come home and talk to me? Whatever it is, we can sort it out. I'm begging you." After sending the message, she sat down, stunned. For the first time in her life, she understood a horrifying truth. You only realize you've offended the wrong person when they turn their back and walk away in silence. The meal was nearly over. My father leaned back in his chair, letting out a rare, relaxed sigh. My mother had stopped her anxious glancing around and was now sitting with perfect posture, carefully eating as if afraid of disturbing the perfect order of this place that felt like it belonged to another world. I looked at my parents, and a sense of calm settled over me. At least for tonight, they were at peace. I picked up my phone. The screen lit up. 83 missed calls. Mark's name dominated the log, interspersed with calls from Carol, a few relatives, and several unknown numbers. I wasn't surprised. I placed the phone back on the table, screen down. My mother saw this and asked softly, "They're calling so much. Are you really not going to answer?" I smiled. "It's not time yet, Mom." Just then, the phone buzzed again. This time, I didn't turn it over. I glanced at the caller ID, a short, simple name. I stood up. "Excuse me, I need to take this call." I walked out to the small private balcony, overlooking the restaurant's courtyard. The night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of flowers. I answered the call. "Yes?" A calm, middle-aged man's voice came through the line. "Is everything all right on your end, Miss Evans?" I got straight to the point. "Everything is fine. It's proceeding exactly as planned." He was silent for a moment, then said, "They're starting to panic. The bank has been calling them non-stop, and the key partners have put things on hold." I murmured a quiet "mhem." "How far would you like to take this?" he asked. I looked through the glass back into the dining room. I saw my parents talking quietly to each other. My mother let out a rare, gentle laugh. I spoke slowly. "No need to escalate further for now. I just need them to understand that everything they have isn't something they can afford to be arrogant about." "Understood," he replied. "You just need to say the word." I hung up. No more needed to be said. I returned to the table. My father looked up. "Who was that?" "Honey." I sat back down. "Just an old acquaintance." My mother studied me for a long time, then asked the question she had been holding in since we walked into the restaurant. "Emily, what is it exactly that you do?" I paused for a moment, then leaned in so only they could hear. "I haven't done anything wrong, Mom. I've just stopped letting other people disrespect my parents." My father looked at me, his eyes a mix of pride and worry. But he didn't ask any more questions. My phone buzzed again, this time with a new notification. I glanced down. A voicemail from Carol. I could see the transcript, her voice trembling so much it was barely coherent. "Emily, I know I was wrong. Please come home and talk." I didn't listen to it. I turned off the screen. I knew they would be calling all night. And the next time I saw them, I would no longer be the daughter-in-law who stood silently in the kitchen. The dinner had been over for a while. A waiter brought out hot tea, placing it silently on the table before retreating. My parents sat together, talking softly about the meal, as if the chaos of the outside world didn't exist. I checked my watch. It was nearly 10 p.m. The phone in my hand vibrated again. This time, I didn't ignore it. "Mark," the screen read, along with the number 83. I stood up. "I'm going to take this." I walked away from the table, standing by the large window that overlooked the valet parking area below. The car lights shimmered like broken pieces of glass. I pressed the answer button. "Hello." Just one word, but on the other end, it was as if a dam had broken. "Emily, where are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Why haven't you been answering your phone? Do you have any idea what's going on at home?" I waited a few seconds before asking calmly, "Are you calling because you're worried about me, Mark? Or because your world is falling apart?" He faltered. "What? What are you talking about?" He stammered. "I'm your husband. Of course, I'm worried about you." I let out a small, cold laugh. "If you were worried about me," I said slowly, "you wouldn't have stayed silent when your mother told my parents to eat in the kitchen." The other end of the line was filled with heavy breathing. It was a crowded party. "Emily, I didn't think it would turn into this." His voice had lost all its strength. "Into this?" I questioned. "You mean the partners pulling out of deals? Or the bank calling you nonstop?" He was stunned into silence. You know about all that? Why do you think I know? I countered. A long pause. Then his voice dropped to an almost plea. Emily, please come home. We can talk this through. My mom is worried sick. She asked me to tell you. Stop. I cut him off, my voice quiet but firm. I'm not coming back. At least, not to apologize. He choked back a reply. You're taking this too far. My job, this directorship, it's not a joke. I looked down at my hand, steady as a rock. You know, Mark, I said, articulating each word. I never intended to interfere with your career, but I also never realized your position was so fragile. Another long silence. I could practically hear him swallow on the other end. Who are you? Emily, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't answer him directly. I just said, very softly, you only need to remember one thing. The power and position you have today are not things you can use to disrespect my parents. With that, I hung up, giving him no chance to reply. I walked back to the table. My mother looked at me, didn't ask a question, but gave a slight nod as if she understood. I sat down and lifted my cup of warm tea. I felt completely at peace, because I knew that from this moment on, the one panicking would no longer be me. The call ended, and Mark stood frozen in the living room, phone still in hand. No one dared to speak. Carol sat motionless in her chair, her hands clenched together. The pacing and shouting were over. On her face, for the first time, was an unfamiliar emotion, fear of loss. Mark was the first to speak, his voice hoarse. She said, "She's not coming home." Carol didn't respond right away. She stared at the polished hardwood floor, where, just hours ago, there had been so much laughter. The party had dissipated so quietly, no one even remembered when it ended. Now, the house felt eerily empty. "Did you say anything else to her?" she asked quietly, her voice losing its edge. "I tried," he replied, "but she's different, Mom. This isn't just her being angry." Carol closed her eyes. A close relative who had stayed behind spoke up hesitantly. Maybe we should go and apologize to her parents first. What was said today was out of line. A few hours ago, that suggestion would have been dismissed with a sharp retort. But this time, Carol didn't argue. She just let out a long, heavy sigh. An apology? I'm afraid it's not that simple anymore. Everyone looked at each other. What do you mean? An aunt asked. Carol hesitated, then spoke slowly. The man from the bank. He mentioned a name. The room fell silent. A name I haven't heard in years and never thought I'd hear again. Mark looked up. What name, Mom? Carol swallowed, her voice dropping to a near whisper. He asked if your wife had any connection to the person who saved our company from bankruptcy years ago. The air in the room turned to ice. Mark was stunned. The person who saved the company? An older uncle frowned. What are you talking about, Carol? I thought that was all settled. Carol opened her eyes, a look of pure dread in them. That's just it. I thought it was settled, so I got careless. She turned to her son. Mark, do you remember when the company was on the verge of collapse? Before your promotion, when we were drowning in debt and the banks were ready to foreclose. Mark nodded. Of course I remember. If that anonymous investor hadn't stepped in to guarantee our loans, we would have been ruined. And do you know who that investor was? Carol asked. He shook his head. No. They never showed up, just signed the papers through a law firm and disappeared. Carol gave a bitter smile. Exactly. And the man from the bank just asked me if my daughter-in-law was connected to that person's trust. A dead silence fell over the room. A relative finally broke it, stammering. That's impossible. She seems so ordinary. Precisely because she seemed ordinary, Carol said, her voice trembling. I never paid attention. Mark slumped into a chair as the pieces began to click into place in his mind. My unnerving calm, my smile as I left, the calls from the bank, the partners backing out, and my final words on the phone. He whispered, If it's really her. Carol looked at her son, and for the first time in his life, she didn't dare raise her voice to him. Tomorrow, she said, you will find where she is. Not to order her, not to blame her, but to ask, to beg for a chance to talk properly. She paused, then her voice almost broke. Because if we truly have offended the wrong person, the price we pay won't just be one ruined party. Elsewhere, in the quiet dining room of a world-class restaurant, I poured more tea for my parents. Outside, the storm was just beginning for them. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that what they were about to face was only the beginning of the truth. The next morning, I woke up early. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of the spacious hotel suite. My parents were still asleep. My mother lay on her side, one hand resting on her chest, her breathing even and deep. My father faced the window, his sleeping posture still as cautious and reserved as he was in life. I poured a glass of water and watched them for a long time. I knew today would be different. Around 8 a.m., my phone buzzed. Not a call, but a short text message. It wasn't from Mark. "I'm in the lobby. I would like to see you and your parents." I read it but didn't reply immediately. I went back into the room and gently woke my parents. My mother, still groggy, asked, "What is it, dear?" I smiled. "Someone is here to see you." My father sat up, instinctively straightening his shirt, a lifelong habit of someone who never wanted to be a bother. "Is it them?" he asked. I nodded. My mother fell silent. After a moment, she sighed softly. "Well, I suppose we should talk and get things cleared up." We went down to the lobby. The hotel was quiet in the morning. The concierge stood perfectly straight behind the marble counter, the soft golden light as welcoming as it was the night before. Carol was sitting on a sofa near the glass entrance. She was dressed simply, with no heavy makeup, her hair tied back neatly. Gone was the loud, commanding woman who had orchestrated the party yesterday. When she saw us approaching, she stood up abruptly, but then she hesitated. Her gaze met my parents' eyes for a second before she quickly looked down, not out of politeness, but because she couldn't bring herself to look her in-laws in the eye. She spoke first, her voice hoarse. I apologize for coming so early. I hope I didn't disturb you." My father gave a slow nod. "It's fine." Just 2 words, but they hung heavy in the air. My mother sat down, placing her handbag neatly beside her. She didn't look at Carol, nor did she appear angry. There was just a quiet dignity, a stark contrast to the deferential woman from the day before. I sat opposite them. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Carol broke the silence. "Yesterday was my fault." Her voice was clear in the quiet lobby. She bowed her head. "I said things I shouldn't have said. I was arrogant, and I looked down on others." I said nothing. My parents remained silent. She clasped her hands together tightly and continued. "I apologize to you both. I am so sorry for hurting you." This time, she looked directly at my parents, though she couldn't hold their gaze for long. My mother looked at her for a long time. Then, in a soft but clear voice, she said, "We don't need an apology for ourselves." Carol looked up, stunned. My mother continued, "Just don't ever look down on anyone else in the future, especially not the parents of your own daughter-in-law." Her words weren't an accusation, but each one landed with precision. Carol nodded repeatedly. "Yes, I understand." She turned to me, her voice softer still. "Emily, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" I looked at her. The familiar arrogance was gone, replaced by the fear of a woman about to lose everything she had taken for granted. "No need," I replied. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here." She faltered, then nodded. "All right. The company. The problems with the company. Was that you?" I neither confirmed nor denied it. I simply said, "I didn't do anything unreasonable. I just allowed things to return to their proper place." She swallowed hard. Can you make it stop?" I looked her straight in the eye for the first time. "That depends on whether all of you truly understand what you did wrong." Silence fell. Carol sat for a long moment. Finally, she whispered, "Some people, you really shouldn't underestimate." I stood up. "My parents need to rest," I said. "We can discuss other matters later." Carol stood up too, taking a step back. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to say this." As we turned to leave, I knew with absolute certainty that the power dynamic in this relationship had shifted forever. We had just stood up when the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the entrance. Mark appeared, his shirt wrinkled, his tie askew. His face was etched with the exhaustion of a sleepless night. He stopped short when he saw his mother standing before my parents, not yelling, not commanding, but with her head bowed lower than he had ever seen. He froze. It was a sight he probably never thought he would witness in his lifetime. "Mark," his mother said, her voice thick with fatigue. "You're here." There was no command in her tone, only the weariness of a mother who was out of her depth. Mark turned to my parents. My father stood tall, his hands behind his back, his gaze steady. My mother sat calmly on the sofa, no longer avoiding eye contact, no longer afraid. He bowed his head slowly. "I'm sorry," he said, the two words harder to get out than he'd imagined. "It was my fault. I failed to protect you yesterday." I looked at him, feeling no triumph, no satisfaction, only a sense of distance. My father nodded. "What's past is past. But some things should never be allowed to happen again." My mother added, her voice still soft. "We don't need an apology for our pride. We just need to be respected." Mark swallowed hard. He turned to me. "Emily, can you come home and talk to me?" I shook my head. "Not today." He looked lost. "Then when?" I looked him straight in the eye. "When you understand that while you are my husband, I am first and foremost my parents' daughter." The words left him speechless. Carol looked from her son to me, and finally said, "She's right." She turned to my parents. "Today, I would like to invite you to a proper meal. Not to atone, but to show our respect." My father looked at my mother, who gave a slight nod. "We accept," my father said, "but as the parents of our daughter, not as guests in the kitchen." Carol bowed her head again. Yes. Lunch that day was a very different affair. No one sat in a position of power. There was no head table, no lower table. There were no scornful glances or cautious whispers. My parents sat with their backs straight, speaking slowly and deliberately. Mark quietly served them food, each movement careful, as if he were relearning how to be a decent human being. And I just watched, because in my heart, a decision was already taking shape. After the meal, I stood up. "I'm taking my parents back to their room to rest." Mark followed me out. "Emily, don't leave me," he pleaded. I turned and looked at him for a long time. "I'm not leaving," I said. "I'm just not going back to my old place." He understood. And for the first time, I saw not anger in his eyes, but a genuine fear of loss. The afternoon passed slowly. My parents were resting in their room. The door was closed, a soft click that, to me, sounded like a new boundary being drawn, a line between what I once tolerated and what I would never tolerate again. Mark waited in the hallway. He didn't call out, didn't try to grab my arm. He just stood there, like someone who knew he had been standing in the wrong place for far too long. I stepped out. "We need to talk," he said first, his voice low. "Tell me everything." I nodded. We sat in a small, empty lounge area. No one else was there, not his mother, not my parents. Just two people who were once husband and wife. "What are you going to do next?" he asked. I didn't answer directly. I asked him a question instead. "If I hadn't stood up and walked my parents out yesterday, would you have ever thought to apologize to them?" His silence was the only answer I needed. "In that case," I said slowly, "don't ask me what I'm going to do. You should be asking if we are even on the same side anymore." He looked up. "I choose you." I looked him straight in the eye. "No." He flinched. "You choose me," I continued. "When you dare to stand with me during the difficult moments, not after you realize you're about to lose everything." He bowed his head, his hands clasped tightly. "I was wrong, but I can fix it." "You can fix it once," I said. "But can you fix a habit of a lifetime?" He didn't answer. Just then, my father came out of the room. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop. He just saw us talking for a long time. He waved for us to stay seated. He looked at Mark for a long moment, not with anger or accusation, but with the steady gaze of a man who had seen most of what life has to offer. "Do you know why I didn't say anything yesterday?" my father asked, his voice deep and slow. Mark shook his head. "Because I wanted to see," my father continued, "if you knew where you were supposed to be standing." The words made Mark freeze. My father went on, each word deliberate. "Being a husband isn't about standing in the middle to keep the peace. It's about choosing the right side, even if it means upsetting someone else. My daughter," he said, glancing at me, "has had a hard life. She didn't need to get married to have a better one. She just needed someone who wouldn't let her parents be disrespected." He turned back to Mark. "If you can do that, then this family still has a chance. If not," he paused, "then letting go now is the kindest thing for both of you." Mark said nothing for a long time. Finally, he stood up and bowed his head low. "I understand. No excuses, no begging. Just two words." I looked at him, no longer angry, no longer holding on to a blind hope. Just clarity. I turned to my father. "Thank you, Dad." He nodded. As I walked away, I knew things could never go back to the way they were. But because of that, I could finally move forward without bowing my head. That evening, I sat alone by the window. The city lights twinkled outside, a vibrant, bustling scene, as if life was proceeding as normal. But for me, everything had changed. Mark stood behind me, keeping a respectful distance. Have you made up your mind? He asked, his voice weary but sincere. I didn't turn around. I made up my mind the moment you stood silently in that kitchen. He clenched his fists. I can change. I'll stand with you. I'll make things clear with my mother. I turned to look at him. Not with anger, not with blame, but without the trust I once had. You're right, I replied. You can change. But I don't want to live in a marriage where I have to wait and see if you have the courage to do so. He went still. You want a divorce? I nodded, without hesitation. I'm not leaving you over money or status, I said, my voice calm. I'm leaving because I don't want to spend the rest of my life teaching someone how to respect my parents. He sank into a chair. After a long silence, he said in a hoarse voice, I lost. Not because of power or money, but because I chose the wrong side for too long. The next morning, I took my parents to breakfast. This time, no one walked ahead, no one was seated in a lesser spot. Just the three of us, talking and laughing softly, like a real family. My mother looked at me and asked quietly, Are you sad? I shook my head. I only regret that I waited so long. My father placed a hand on my shoulder. Knowing when to stand up is a strength in itself. On the other side of the city, Mark's family began to pay the price. Not with loud scandals or public disgrace, but with a quiet, creeping understanding that the things they took for granted were, in fact, incredibly fragile. Carol called me one last time. Emily, I don't dare ask you to come back, she said, her voice tired. I just hope you don't hate me. I replied softly, I don't hate you, but I'm not coming back. The call ended. I turned off my phone. I watched my parents walking slowly ahead of me. Two figures who had walked together for a lifetime, and for the first time, were walking beside their daughter without having to lower their heads. I knew that from this day forward, I didn't need a marriage to define my worth. And my parents would never again have to sit in anyone's kitchen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from sadness or regret, but because fragments of memory were replaying in my mind, slow and vivid, as if I was finally calm enough to see everything clearly without making excuses for anyone. The room was quiet. The only sound the steady tick-tock of a clock. My parents were already asleep, a deeper, more peaceful sleep than they'd had in years. I knew that since leaving that house, a great weight had been lifted from them, even if they never said it aloud. I sat by the window, looking at the city lights. The tall buildings, the bright lights, the busy people, all of it once represented a world I thought I had to endure to fit in, to be a good daughter-in-law. But now, I realized how small all of that was compared to my parents' dignity. I remembered that afternoon, my father standing silently in the kitchen, my mother with her head bowed, and my husband, silent. His silence wasn't loud, but it was heavier than any angry word. Some wounds don't come from what people say, but from the silence of those who were supposed to speak up. I wondered, if I hadn't stood up that day, where would my parents be sitting in 10 or 20 years? In another kitchen? In another forgotten corner? I took a deep breath. For the first time, I saw clearly that I hadn't lost anything. On the contrary, I had escaped a life where I constantly had to ask for permission to be respected. The next morning, I woke with a different feeling. No panic, no heaviness in my chest. Just a strange sense of lightness. Like someone who has finally set down a burden they didn't even realize they were carrying. My father was making coffee. My mother was preparing breakfast. Simple, ordinary things. But in that scene, I saw something I'd never truly noticed before. My parents were living slowly, and they were no longer afraid. My mother looked at me and asked gently, Do you have any regrets? I shook my head without a second thought. No, Mom. She was silent for a moment, then nodded. That's all that matters. 3 simple words. But I understood. It wasn't just an answer for me. It was an answer for all the years she had endured for my sake. I went back to my room and opened my phone. A single unread message from my ex-husband. It was short. I'm sorry, I understood too late. I stared at the words for a long time, then turned off the screen. Not out of hatred, but because I understood that some apologies, when they come on time, can heal. When they come too late, they are just an ending. And for me, that story had finally come to a close. The new house wasn't large. Just a small bungalow on a quiet, tree-lined street. In the morning, you could hear bird song, and in the afternoon, sunlight streamed through the leaves. It wasn't a place that made people gasp in awe, but the moment I stepped inside, I knew my parents would be able to breathe here. On moving day, my mother wiped down every surface, not because it was dirty, but out of habit. My father arranged the potted plants we'd brought from their old place, occasionally looking up at the sky as if to check if this place was peaceful enough to stay for good. "It's a small house," my father said, his voice calm. "But it'll do." Just 3 words. But I knew that for my father, "it'll do" meant we don't have to bow our heads here. In the days that followed, life slowed down. My father would wake up early, open the door, and water his plants, with no clock to rush him. Sometimes he would stand for a long time, just looking at a new leaf, smiling to himself. My mother would cook not to meet someone else's schedule, not worrying if someone would complain about the salt, but just cooking for her family. One afternoon, as we were having lunch, my mother said suddenly, "It's been a long time since I've been able to eat a meal without feeling like I have a lump in my throat." I stopped eating. My father put down his fork, looked at my mother for a long time, and nodded. Yes, a long time. No one needed to explain further. We all understood that for years, even at a full table, there was always something that was hard to swallow. In the evenings, the 3 of us would watch TV. My father would often doze off. My mother would gently place a blanket over him, a familiar gesture, but now without the old anxiety in her eyes. I watched them and realized something that made my heart ache a little. All my parents ever needed was a place to be at peace. It didn't have to be wealthy or impressive. It just had to be a place where they weren't looked down upon. Before bed, one night, my mother came into my room and said softly, "Don't worry about us. Emily, this is more than enough." I took her hand. "I'm sorry. I let you both endure so much for so long." She shook her head. "It wasn't your fault. We just put up with it for too long." That night, listening to the wind outside, I felt a deep sense of peace. I knew that whatever lay ahead, at least my parents would never again be the people in the kitchen. And for me, that alone was a victory. After that, I heard nothing more from my ex-husband's family. The calls stopped, the messages ceased. The silence was profound, and in its own way, the loudest confirmation of their defeat. My ex-husband kept his job, but the power that came with it had diminished. Partners became more cautious. Deals moved slower. Carol, his mother, had learned a hard lesson. As she once admitted to a relative, "I used to think she was meek because she was weak." Turns out, the quietest ones are the most dangerous when they no longer need to say a word. As for me, I returned to my work, now under my own name, on my own terms. Life was simple. Mornings were for walks with my parents, afternoons for work, and evenings for quiet family dinners. Someone once asked me, "Aren't you going to explain who you really are?" I just smiled. "I know who I am. That's enough." One evening, over a simple meal, my mother put a piece of fish on my plate. "Looking at you now," she said, "I feel so at ease." My father nodded. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, Emily. You're living as you should." That was more than enough for me. That night, it began to rain, a soft, gentle drizzle that washed the dust from the streets. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the sound, feeling a profound and natural peace. Dinner was simple: a hot soup, a small casserole, a bowl of steamed vegetables. As we ate in the quiet rhythm of the rain, my mother suddenly said, "You know, back then, when she told us to go to the kitchen, I wasn't angry." I paused. "I was just sad," she continued slowly, "because I saw you stay silent." I looked down at my plate. My father put down his fork and said gently, "But you stood up, and that was enough." Those 3 words, "that was enough," made a lump form in my throat. I looked at the 2 people who had endured so much for me and realized something I had never dared to think before. If a marriage requires the sacrifice of your parents' dignity, it's better not to have it at all. My mother smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. "It's better now. A small house is fine, as long as no one has to bow their head." Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside our small home, it was warm. I remembered the scornful looks, the cruel words, and the moment I took my parents' hands and walked out that door. If I could go back, I would do it all again. Because the moment I chose to stand with my parents, my own life finally stood with me. I picked up my bowl and smiled. "Eat, Mom, Dad. The soup is getting cold." My father nodded and said something so quietly I almost missed it, words I will carry with me forever. "A house doesn't need to be large," he said. "It just needs to be big enough to hold your dignity." I finally understood. My story wasn't about winning or losing. It was the story of a daughter learning to stand tall, and of a family finally sitting down to eat in their rightful place. Outside, the rain was stopping. And inside my heart, everything was finally at peace. Lesson learned. This story isn't about victory or defeat, or about proving who is better. It's a simple reminder. Never trade your dignity for a false sense of peace. Never allow the title of family to be an excuse for others to disrespect your parents. Sometimes, the deepest wounds don't come from shouted insults, but from the silence of those who should have defended you. Whether as a wife, a husband, or a child, we must remember one fundamental truth. If a marriage requires your parents to bow their heads, it is not a partnership of happiness, but an endurance test wrapped in the label of family. You don't need to be better than anyone else in life. You just need to stand in your rightful place and ensure that the people you love are never put in the wrong one. Because a house doesn't need to be large. It just needs to be big enough to hold your dignity. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever stayed silent for the sake of family, or if you have ever stood up to protect your parents, please like and share this to spread the message. Leave a comment with your thoughts and share it with someone who needs to hear it.